First of all, what is industrial policy? There's a number of different definitions floating around. Any deviation from sectoral policy neutrality or deviation from laissez-faire, that's Ann Harrison's definition. Policy attempts to alter the structure of production, that's Howard Pack's definition. Or policy interventions to tilt market prices in favor of one activity over another. That's what we're talking about, government intervention to promote a particular sector. Instruments are typically these: tariffs, tax breaks, subsidies through the budget, including special programs, procurement. Botswana, for example, has a new procurement policy favoring domestic enterprises. State enterprise pricing: you sell your electricity to one sector more cheaply than another. Or subsidized credit programs are also quite common through different development banks. There's also instruments of what Harrison and Rodriguez-Sklar called soft industrial policy. And here, these are instruments kind of once removed from particular sectors, but often have a sectoral focus. They include things like organizing sectors for promotion of standards, common standards in one or another industry, export promotion, or particular aspects of infrastructure that are intended to benefit one activity over another. Two conclusions, I think, just from this formulation of both definition and instruments are first of all, virtually all countries have industrial policies. They may not call them that, but in fact they do. The United States, for example, had industrial policies in agriculture that favored innovation in agriculture for all kinds of reasons. Virtually all countries use some mixture of both hard industrial policy elements and soft industrial policy elements. That's the first point. The second point is that industrial policy has an opportunity cost. Almost always when you support one activity, you do so at the cost of penalizing another activity. And that's the reason why it's so important to analyze very carefully how the industrial policy plays through the system. If you put, for example, a tax break into the tax code, you're obviously not doing something with those resources that you could be doing so. Similarly, tariffs on inputs may penalize downstream manufacturers. So there's always an opportunity cost here that sometimes is lost sight of in the literature. Also, industrial policies have many different objectives. Of course, we're interested from a development perspective and in the development community on things like competitiveness and productivity. But the green agenda also focuses on other things. It focuses on innovation, particularly in areas where we know we need technologies but don't have them, such as in energy efficiency and the like. The trade agenda is also very important, moving up the value-added ladder, promoting exports, or sometimes efficient import substitution. We also see employment objectives as being common. I think one thing you see very frequently when you go out and talk to governments and examine government policy is that often programs have multiple objectives, which actually often obscure any single one. And many times a particular program has several objectives, but without any kind of quantifiable indicators of success, a point I'll come back to in just a moment. Economic rationales for government intervention in particular sectors throughout the literature center around market failures. There's various types of market failures that are analyzed. I won't go into any of these in great detail. They'll come up a little bit as we discuss particularly green technologies. But the issue of externalities or the issue of lack of appropriability of benefits from resources are really very important. Informational asymmetries are important. From the trade community, we've often talked about latent comparative advantage. If you can just put a tariff in place, you can establish a firm, lower long-run average cost curves, remove the tariff, and it will be efficient in the market. The literature goes through these kinds of market failures in great detail, and I think is germane to some aspects of the green agenda. But the real question is, does industrial policy work? And here we have two distinct points of view. We have Danny Roderick, perhaps the apostate of industrial policy, an economist at Harvard, written extensively on the topic. And indeed, he cites a number of studies. One recent study, for example, is of China's industrial policy done by Philippe Aguillon and a group of authors. And they find that, indeed, subsidies to particular industries do record higher levels of TFP, total factor productivity, in the firms which receive those subsidies, with one proviso. And that proviso is, in this particular study, that the subsidies go into competitive sectors, that the firms in those sectors are not insulated from entry. What does Danny Roderick conclude? It's not surprising to observe, he says, that industrial restructuring rarely takes place without government assistance. Scratch the surface of non-traditional export successes anywhere in the world, and you will find more often than not industrial policies, public research and development, public support, export subsidies, preferential trade agreements, and other similar interventions lurking beneath the surface. This is one view. There's the Pack and Sagi review in 2005, which went through a whole series of literature on this topic. It's a study I'd commend to you. Their conclusion is no. Look, if you look behind the scene at Japan's success, they cite a particular study, for example, which shows that indeed subsidies and tariffs protected inefficient industries. And it was the sectors that were unprotected that did not get the subsidies that provided the growth impetus over Japan's long and impressive historical experience of growth. They conclude from their review, in recent industry successes, public interventions have played only a limited role. Moreover, the recent ascendance and dominance of industrial production networks in sectors in which developing countries once had considerable success implies a further limitation on the potential role of industrial policies. Overall, there appears to be little empirical support for an activist government policy, even though market failures exist that can, in principle, justify industrial policy. So when you stand back and look at these two points of view, you're kind of confronted with the Carlos Braga question or response to, does industrial policy work? Well, maybe combination of yes and no. Harrison and Andres Rodriguez-Sklar at Harvard went through and reviewed for the NBER about 150 studies of industrial policy. And this is a terrific review, by the way. It's extremely weighty. It's probably 150 or 200 pages in length. But it's a very sophisticated review, much like the Pack and Sagi review. And they conclude that soft industrial policies have a higher probability and rate of success. Remember, hard industrial policies, tariffs, subsidies to sectors, tax breaks, domestic content requirements. Some of these things, of course, are WTO legal. Their view of that as compared to soft industrial policy, roads and ports designed to increase trade, special credit, promotion for clusters and export promotion, they conclude that the hard industrial policy indeed has problematic effects and rarely can be predicted to be successful in any given instance. But a lot of the soft industrial policy measures indeed have been successful. One thing they did conclude that's particularly relevant for the trade and I think the green community is that increasing exposure to trade competition is a common element of success. Trade and FDI policies have generated the greatest welfare gains when they are associated with increasing exposure to trade. Or they go on in another place and say, interventions that increase exposure to trade, such as export promotion, are likely to lead to higher welfare gains than other types of intervention, such as tariffs and domestic content requirements. Why is that? Because promoting firm activity into the global marketplace leads to dynamic learning economies at the firm level, and these carry over into higher productivity growth. If you stand back and look, for example, at the aid for trade literature, you also find that industrial policy, particularly soft industrial policy, is a common feature of aid for trade. In fact, we did a little study for the OECD and WTO that came out in the July Global Review. And we found that about 20% of the case stories, they requested case stories from all over the world, as some of you may know. They received 269 case stories from governments, from NGOs, from donors about aid for trade and what was working or not. And what they found of this 269 case stories, when we did the analysis, we found that some 17% were really contained elements of soft industrial policy. This was a big surprise, and when we went into the study, we didn't even have this category of activities, but they were so prevalent we decided to create this theme. These included things like Brazil's cotton projects in the cotton for to help the cotton in West Africa upgrade their quality. Efforts to upgrade tea in Rwanda or fish in Grenada. Other efforts included organic coffee in Guatemala or helped to provide phones to phone ladies. They created a whole new industry in Bangladesh. The thing these things had in common were that almost all increased exposure to trade competition and to learning economies from exporting. The literature focuses then on, asks the question, what you promote, what is it you should promote, and I think concludes what you promote matters. Some have focused on things like promoting emerging sectors or skill-intensive sectors or manufactured exports. Depending on what study you read, you can find a lot of these different and often vaguely defined kinds of admonitions. Be careful, however, because this literature routinely overlooks agriculture and services as vehicles to growth. That's the first point. And then, of course, for any given country, you really can't take these admonitions as being entirely practical because each country's circumstance is different. I prefer another set of literature that focuses on types of activities rather than sectors as providing guidance on what to promote. Danny Roderick asserts that you should promote only new activities and not sectors. By new activities, he means helping firms get to market, whether it's into an export market or even the domestic market, rather than focus on particular sectors, and certainly do not support sunset sectors. For example, in Botswana, a country I've been doing some work on, a lot of industrial policy goes to support a textile industry, which many people think is inefficient. And that's a fairly common phenomena throughout the world. Harris and Rodriguez-Sklar argue that it should be activities with spillovers. Danny Roderick emphasizes tradables. Agagnon emphasizes sectors that are competitively structured. So I would assert that rather than what you promote matters, what's even more important is how you promote particular activities. And so let me be bold here and in response to Aaron's challenge, assert 10 principles of smart industrial policy. I should say in advance that I've stolen some of this from Danny Roderick, though I've modified it with my own list. So here goes. First of all, a good first place to begin is by removing policy barriers to particular exports or to particular activities. Policy barriers can take the form of government regulations, visa requirements, for example. Remove institutional obstacles that may hamper production, and focus on reducing cost elements in the value chain that limit production and exports. This is what a lot of aid for trade is doing, and I think quite positively so. A second element, a second principle is transparency. Quantify the amounts of money you're spending in the whole category of industrial policy and submit it to Parliament. This is what New Zealand does, for example, when it looks at tax expenditures. Each year, as part of the budget process, it goes to the budget, and you can see where the government is giving up tax revenue to promote a particular activity, and that can be measured then against outcomes and objectives. I think a first place for many countries to start, in fact most countries, is to begin by quantifying the industrial policy you have, because frequently governments have all of these policies, but rarely are the cost to consumers and the cost to the budget accurately accounted for in one area or another. A third principle that's really very important, and this comes out of Danny Roderick's study, focus your incentives or your subsidies on only new activities. Refrain from giving subsidies to existing activities because often those are sunset industries. They should survive already under market conditions, and if they don't, that should be an indication that maybe they should go out of business so that those resources can be released to more dynamic activities. Fourth, be clear on objectives and have benchmarks of success and failure. One of the things we noticed in our little study for the WTO of the 269 case stories is that many of these stories had very few indicators, quantitative indicators, of success. And therefore, when you're winning, you really don't know because you can't compare them with what actually happened. Sunset clauses are really very important. When incentives are given, make sure that they automatically phase out after some number of years. In the United States, for example, there was a temporary tariff and subsidies given to the motorcycle industry. And the good news there was it was a 3-year limit, it was phased out, and actually that happened to be a success that kept Harley-Davidson in the market. And you can see them running around Geneva from time to time if you want. Projects should entail private risk commensurate with public risks. Too frequently, and I think particularly the discussions and the industrial policy towards the financial sector, we don't usually think about this as industrial policy, but indeed it is. The industrial policies after that were adopted after 2008 and virtually, well, many of the rich countries absorbed a lot of public risks and didn't really put the risk onto the private sector sufficiently. Seventh principle, competition. This is really terribly important. Avoid raising barriers to competition and particularly import competition in this story. That comes out very strongly time and time again in the literature. And this is also very important, I think, as we think about establishing green industries and green policy. Subsidies, direct subsidies that are time-bound are a much better instrument. Eighth, administer industrial policy in a way that the staff who is doing the industrial policy has a demonstrated competence with clear political oversight and accountability. For example, in Rwanda, the Rwandan Development Board is able to give out subsidies, but those must be approved by the Ministry of Finance. So there's an internal set of oversight on this. Still, we find very commonly in the developing world that agencies often that are granting the investment incentives or the industrial promotion really don't have the competence to judge whether or not a particular project is going to be successful. Maintaining communication with the private sector without being captured by the private sector is always a challenge, but it's terribly important. And then finally, subjecting the portfolio of projects that benefit from industrial policy to ex post, often external evaluation is really important. So these are my 10 principles of ways to promote industrial policy and smart industrial policy effectively. I have a little story to tell about Solyndra. I don't know that I have a chance to tell it. If I don't, I'll go right to the conclusion. Should I go right to the
conclusion? We can bring out Solyndra.
Okay, Solyndra is a great story, but I won't tell it now. It's both positive and negative, I should say. But we'll come back. So anyway, just to conclude, what is smart industrial policy? To me, smart industrial policy begins by focusing on removing policy obstacles and other obstacles. Sometimes they require public investment, and creating proper incentives to specific activities. Those measures that abide by the 10 principles I've suggested, indeed, I think constitute smart industrial policy, especially competition, transparency, and sunset clauses. Can it be done successfully? I think there's abundant evidence that the answer is yes. But how you do it and what you do is really very important. And soft industrial policies tend to work and have a much higher success rate than do hard industrial policies. And be careful here, by the way. There's little conclusive evidence in the literature that industrial policy by itself explains the high rates of growth that we've seen in East Asia or in the top 15 or 16 performers since 1980 in terms of rapid growth. If you took a look, for example, at the top 15 or 16 countries that grew more rapidly in the global economy since 1980, you'd find that one of them is Chile. Well, Chile, we know, has particular soft industrial policies, but most importantly is perhaps one of the most neutral policy regimes that is out there. So there's little conclusive evidence, I think, that industrial policy is the secret to long-term growth. And finally, can it be replicated? The good news is, yes, it can be, although each with country-specific characteristics. The bad news is that bad policies, too, can be replicated. So caveat emptor. With that, let me conclude.